Okay, we're going to move on. Our next speaker is Jim Thorne. Jim is with the, and I just had it, I know it's the Center for...
Information Center for the Environment.
Information Center for the Environment at UC Davis. He's a postdoc, and he has a personal interest in oaks, and I know we've talked a few times about planting oaks along Buda Creek in Davis, and also we cooperated on a project, American Canyon near Vallejo, where there was some planting of oaks and looking at livestock impacts. So he's going to talk about this project down in Davis. Jim.
It's quite a, can you guys hear me? Quite an honor to get to present after these eminent scientists and researchers. And this is going to be sort of the Oak Regen Light part of the talk. And I think I'm going to try to focus on strategies that are useful for getting oaks to be planted in different types of environments. And so that a lot of this is, the science has already been worked out, you know, and here I was a grad student at UC Davis, and I came across a tree that was loaded with acorns, and I stuffed my pockets full, and the next day I found his book in the library, and it was like, oh, I can plant these things. I could, and so it's somewhat of that story. Let's see, how does this thing work? There we go. And so we have some things that we show to the students, or to, I've worked with a group called the Society for Conservation Biology, the UC Davis chapter, which is mostly grad students and some undergrads, and over the years they've provided the nucleus to get a number of different little initiatives to get oaks out into the community and out into various types of plantings. We can run through acorns. A lot of the place that we get our acorns is at the UC Davis Arboretum. So there's trees there that predate the campus, I believe. They're pretty darn big trees in any case. And so in terms of getting local genetic material, I frequently will go to that, or I'll go to big old trees within the city and look to collect acorns from those locations. And, you know, you can stick them in the fridge, and then it's really easy to sprout them. And following the bullet points in the Regenerating Rangeland Oaks book. And so I started doing that, and started getting little groups together to do potting parties. This is Ruth is now the president of Tree Davis, which is a little urban forestry group in the town of Davis. And when we started, we would go to the MU, the student coffee and lunch spot, and get them to give us their old containers. And we'd slice the bottoms off containers, we'd duct tape them together, and create the deep pots that are needed to allow the roots to extend. And we did that for a number of years until we eventually met a guy who had some funding, and he actually started providing us with things that we didn't have to build them. But we did probably 3 or 4 seasons in this way. And it was nice because we were recycling stuff, and it was also a great recruitment tool for getting students involved. It's like a small little task, and you get people to start doing stuff, and then they start getting interested, and then, you know, maybe they'll stick around. You know, and we'd sprout them out, grow them up. Davis has a number of different greenhouses, and greenhouse bench space is pretty cheap. This year we're actually over at Cal Fire because they have a big facility there that had been mostly mothballed, but Rich Maravich, who's been helping to support our efforts, got permission to use their facility. So we're in there, and we're sticking. But one thing that we found was that greenhousing the sprouts, once you've potted them, is great because they'll grow faster. You'll get a bigger thing to transplant out if you can get them in there for a month to 6 weeks. So, and then there was the question of well, where are we going to put them? And the SCB approach was to try to do some community outreach, and to both to get campus involved. We got a number of grade schools around the city of Davis involved. For a couple of years there, we had teachers bringing acorns into their classrooms and letting the kids grow the acorns up, and then organizing plantings, and then the kids would bring the trees to the plantings. And that was actually quite successful. At the height of that particular initiative, we had about 17 classrooms involved with growing things. And the trees weren't always the best looking starts, but on the other hand, you were getting lots of people to get involved. And that's, really one of the things I was interested in is how do we sort of make this part of a culture rather than a practice? How do we just make it like, oh, I need some trees, I'll sprout a few acorns and then I can put them in my backyard or wherever. And so how do we move that forward? And it had some unexpectedly positive interactions we ran into lots of people who were very supportive. And so I'll talk a little bit about that and take you on a little tour through some of the places that we've done work. So this is the Davis campus is up in the upper right-hand side, and actually all the way across to the left are the experimental fields. And then there's Puda Creek coming along the south side of the campus there, flowing to the east into the causeway. And so we'll first visit the Puda Creek plantings, and then we'll go over to the campus and just kind of work our way around. This is about I think we're in year 7 or 8 now. I haven't kept very close track. The upper left is Old Davis Road as you go down from the campus, and like many roads in the Central Valley, there are the remnants of walnut orchards that are lining these roads. And so one of the things that's really exciting to me is that we should be planting along roadsides, and that there are occasionally opportunities where you'll run into people who are open to that. And so then you can actually look at developing these linear features of plantings and putting in oaks. And just south of that upper left is a planting in Solano County that was a bicycle lane installation. And Solano County got a $1 million grant to accommodate the bike racers of Davis, the famous, we had Lawrence Armstrong there earlier this year. That was pretty exciting. And they planted trees, and those trees were, this was urban forestry. The trees going in were this tall, and they planted both valley oak and I think coast live oak. And now, 3 or 4 years later, you can see that those are starting to actually become nice lined roadsides, a nicely lined roadside. So there are a number of examples of that. And then the road crews are taking out the remainder of the old walnuts, and you can see the other trees coming in. So it's sort of this, what roads can we line? And the arguments for lining roads are, A, it's a windbreak, B, it's going to throw shade on your concrete, which is going to reduce your maintenance costs over the long term, and C, it's very aesthetic. So, you actually may be able to convince people, although you'll get a lot of pushback from people who are worried about safety, but you can point to Europe and say, look, in Europe, if a 25-year-old drunk male drives off the road and smashes his car, it's his fault, not the agency's fault. So that's the big pushback that you'll generally run into. But you can engage people in that conversation and then see, how can you move it forward? How can you try to move forward plantings along roads? So it's a nice example if you're ever there. Just take the UC Davis exit and turn south, and within a couple miles you'll see this nice stretch of trees coming up. And then I used to live right out there on this ranch, and planted some trees which I watered once a week, and I found that if you water them once a week, it makes a tremendous amount of difference in the above ground growth that you'll get. That if you water them once a month, we had some trees we were watering once a month, and others, these ones I was watering once a week, and I was getting 3 to 4 feet of growth with the once a week watering. So if your objective is to get some structure in there quickly, then getting them on some kind of irrigation is a great idea, especially if you're in these smaller environments where you're really looking at the interstitial spaces, or you're looking at an opportunity to get a couple trees in, not necessarily a whole stand. So here's the bridge looking east along Puda Creek during flood, and it turns out that this is actually, there's about a 5-mile stretch of the creek that's owned by the university, and a number of years ago it actually became a reserve that they actually put some managers in charge of, so there's been a restoration effort along this stretch of the creek. And the managers have been taking about 100 starts a year from us. I've been pushing them. In the first couple of years we went to plant them, and then subsequently they've been planting them, and then subsequently they're like, well, we're not sure we have any more space, but I keep encouraging them to find additional locations. So I'm going to show you first just some general plantings, and we'll take a walk along a couple miles of the creek here. So there's Rich, who started providing us with some mulch or some plant potting mix materials, and there's the UC Davis greenhouse. We're loading them up. And then it's a pretty used landscape. There's the Transcontinental Railroad, and the I-80 is right nearby, and you know this is definitely a working landscape. And so we're out there doing plantings, and this was our first field that we worked in. Is just right there, and we put in about, I don't know, over a couple years, maybe 120 trees into there, with the idea that the eucalyptus would eventually get girdled, but you didn't want to girdle them and move them out until you actually had some valley oaks coming in, so that you'd have some structure for the bird life. And this was our poster child for a number of years for the planting advertisements. Some researchers on campus brought their boy along. And then this is looking at that today. So I just went out a few days ago and just took photographs, and these are all of these trees are at least 4 years old. We watered them the first year about once a month, and then they got one mowing, and then there was a fire in there at one point. But there hasn't been a whole lot of consistent maintenance, and we have quite a range of success, from no success at all in the lower left to some decent looking trees that might be overhead now. A few of them, one of those overhead trees died in the last year, probably got gnawed by rodents. But overall I'd say we have 60 or 70 trees that are established and are coming along in that particular field. And there's a couple more views. You can see them kind of sticking their heads up over the invasive grasses there. And then we're moving further west. I said east before, but I meant west. I'm a geographer. Under the trestle to the next large set. And these are essentially upper benches of an incised. The Poudre Creek is incised, and the further you get towards the Coast Range, the more incised it is. We're working entirely within the flood, within the levees, and you get on the other side of the levees, it's all working landscape. It's either the UC Davis campus or it's private ranch land. So we're working within levees, and we're working on upper terraces, so we're not actually in the full riparian zone, but we're trying to address these. Here it is, the upper terraces. And this area they actually drill seeded native grasses into, and it's the old Restoration site, if people have ever heard of that. There was a little grassroots effort to do things before the reserve managers were in place, and they planted a number of things, a number of native species in this area. But then once it became systematically managed, in this area the idea was, first let's wipe out the non-native grasses, let's try planting native grasses, and let's come back and throw oaks over the top. And this has been a very successful area. The oaks seem to respond really well. There's probably decent groundwater, and some of them, they're not really getting watered, and a portion of them got burned, but some of them are quite large just in a few years, like this one in the upper left. And but they're quite variable. So this picture here may be a little hard to see. There's a smaller one in the foreground and a much larger one in the background, and those probably aren't, no more than a year apart in age. So there's quite a variation. There's a lot of coyote brush that's been planted around there, and we get a lot of nice insects using that. And then we move further west, and we go under we underpass I-80 and move into the west campus. And on the north side, it's all experimental fields, and then on the south side there is the Poudre Creek Reserve, and people run their dogs out there, and it's quite a popular spot. And at this point, the creek is incised by 40 to 50 feet. So you're starting to get multiple inner benches coming out, and the further you get towards winters, it can be, I don't know, maybe 60 to 80 feet in places. And we're working again on those upper benches. in these locations. And in these locations, we started the same way with just going out, and Andrew Folks, who's the manager, and JP would have identified where they want the trees to go in. Sometimes we would drill the holes the day before, and then we'd have a planting. We'd bring a lot of people out, and a successful planting gets the community pleasantly involved. And we were doing them individually. But recently, in the last year or so, there's been less. I've been focusing more on producing starts and getting them to many different groups, giving them out to as many restoration groups as I can, rather than actually holding planting days. And then on the reserve, what that has kind of led to is that they're doing it maybe in a more traditional style, which is what you see down in the lower right, where they'll overplant, they'll put in 100 trees within a smaller area, but with the idea that we're going to get enough trees establishing in this area that we're taken care of. We don't have to come back and do other backfill or infill plantings, whereas if you're doing it iteratively, you may wind up over the course of 8 or 9 years coming back and going, oh, well, we had a fairly high mortality, we got to put a few more trees back into these locations. So and that, I would say that both of those models work. It depends on how many people you have and how good your outreach is to bringing people in to work on things. And so, yeah, so there's some pictures of the plantings that just went in this year. I think it's the 100-year celebration for Davis, and they wanted to do 100 trees on the reserve this year. We gave them those trees. We've supplied the reserve for, I think, 5 years now. So that's you've just gone from the road there over to the west campus. Now we're going to shift up to the upper right to the main campus. I'm going to run you through what plantings look like on the main campus. And I did a little interview with Skip Mesger, who is the chief landscape architect on the campus, and so he had some interesting comments. Of course, it has its own set of challenges when you're in an urban environment. There are disturbances, but the disturbances are different from the native environment. And but we essentially found that the campus was quite open to plantings, and the things that they were concerned with are we going to be responsible for watering? And if we're going to be responsible for watering, we want it on our irrigation systems. We don't have to put in new stuff. And if we're not going to be, who's going to take care of them? Is it going to be worthwhile? And then another thing that they were worried about is whose fields are you planting around? So are you going to be throwing shade on various agricultural experiments? You better go talk to those people if you're off in farther locations. But essentially for 3 or 4 years we were putting 80 to 100 trees a year in on the campus, and the grounds people would go out and put in little flags and say, here's where we want you to put them. And then for 2 years they actually had funding to get a water truck to include some of the stuff that was off the irrigation and hit those as part of the watering. Then they lost the water truck, or they lost their funding, and so more recently it hasn't looked that way. But we've been doing a lot of stuff along parking lots and the vet med facility. We put in probably 150, 200 trees around the vet med facility over a couple of years, which is these new buildings that went in. And so you can see that a lot of times we'll put stuff in, and then the next year there's a construction project, and you lose some of the things that you've potted or planted, or sometimes you don't lose them. And sometimes if they're out on these islands, there's remarkable variation in success in these hot locations in the middle of parking lots. But I'm quite enthused about parking lots. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So yeah, the upper right, there's some trees that they're all, and the lower right, those trees were planted in the same year in parking lots, and in some of the islands they did great, and in other islands they didn't do that great. And then in the upper left those trees are not on irrigation at all, and the lower left not on irrigation, but we were able to water it for the first year or so. So I think it just kind of slows them down if they don't get watered. Even this very harsh upper left, those trees were still alive for the most part. There were some dead ones, but they were actually still hanging out in their tree tubes 2 years later, and they might actually make it over the long run. We don't face the deer problem, so we're mostly just with these small blue tree tubes. And then, so the upper left, again, is an off irrigation, and then the other three we're planting into lawns, and those are about the same year, maybe 3 years ago now, and those trees are coming along great. They're starting to almost need to be propped up. So in some places, those things are now working out quite well. And one of the interesting things, let's see, and then another challenge is how do you get into certain types of landscaping? And in the vet med, they have these big ivy patches. And the guy's like, well, Skip was like, you can plant in the ivy patches. Go ahead, give it a try. And we had very mixed success. I'd say low survivability within those. But on the other hand, it's a lot of area. If you can start taking over ivy, you can actually take over some pretty nice pieces of landscaping that weren't claimed. And one of the things that emerged was that a grassroots program is different. The campus now has kind of taken to heart putting in native trees and valley oaks in their planning process. So one of the unexpected results was we were out there planting away, and Skip's like, well, this is really nice, but the way that we work on campus is we work on a per project basis. There's a building that gets put in, there's an area that gets re-landscaped, and he now is requiring that any new buildings, any new things have some percentage of native trees and have some percentage of valley oaks going in, whereas before that was not in the consciousness. And so I think one of the messages is if you're working with any kind of an urban environment, who's requiring the mitigation on construction projects and get them to increase the natives, the percentage of natives that are going to be required in the plantings around those construction projects, because you're going to ultimately make those areas more permeable. So upper left is one of ours, upper right, center, lower left are plantings that just happened in the last year or so, where you've got valley oaks, at least some valley oaks included, whereas before there might not have been any. And then one of the glorious successes at UC Davis is this parking lot that's just off of Russell Boulevard in California. If you're ever Fifth Avenue in California, it's right there. It's a dorm parking lot, and it's all valley oak, and it's about 8 or 9 years. We didn't plant it; they were already up. But it's now really coming into its own. It's really starting to fill over. And it turns out that another pushback that you'll get from maintenance people is they're like, oh, acorns are a problem. They drop and then they disintegrate and they turn into this goo. And so they actually, it's not necessarily the landscape architects, it's the maintenance people who are concerned about the slurry that comes out. And you can point out with one of the arguments for valley oaks is that, hey, they're only going to really do that every other year, or maybe even less predictably than that, as we recently heard. And so by comparison, at least on campus, to the cork oak, which produces a huge number of acorns every year and messes the quad up every year, you can actually get them to go, oh, well, that's less bad. And Skip has kind of come around. When we first started talking about this, he was very resistant, and now he's like, well, you need to, it's just the price you pay for getting the right tree in the right place, and there's a little bit of maintenance that comes along with that. And so these are a bit anecdotal, but what I'm hoping is that maybe some of you are involved with different types of restoration projects, and that these are little tricks or discussions that we've had that have allowed for a more inclusive group of people to be sticking trees in, and you really just look for those types of opportunities. And then here's another wonderful set of oaks that's over by the vet med facility, and these ones actually there's a corral right behind it, and so maybe some horse urine or something has helped to fertilize them a little bit, but they may be 10 to 12 years old, and it's just a wonderful lined street. And so one of the things that I'm quite interested in is, can we develop outreach materials that give examples of how do you get trees in along roads. And the Highway 113 corridor is a great example with Tree Davis and the Woodland Tree Foundation. Ken's work over there planting trees along freeways and along county roads. How do we start that effort? How do we? Oh, I'm sorry. There was one more piece. Starting to wrap up there. So Another thing that's interesting about the Puda Creek bit, before we get to the final story, is that there's been a lot of different groups do restoration on Puda Creek over the years. The city of Davis has had a restoration project that went in right in this zone in here. And there's been plantings, and I think that there's an emerging property of connectivity. That, 10 years ago, there was no water in that creek, and it was all getting sloughed off to Solano County. Now there's a permanent flow. There's stream restoration efforts, and there's also been multiple different groups that have gone in and done plantings. And one of the things that's interesting is that we're now finding that there's almost continuous riparian from winters up in here all the way through. So there's an emerging property of connectivity from uncoordinated plantings in this area. And so one of the things that you can look for are, what are my opportunities to create linear biological features on a landscape, either along roads or along creek beds, something that is going to allow for more permeability, more animal movement, and you're establishing, maybe in some cases re-establishing connections that used to be in these areas. And we've contributed a lot of starts to projects along those zones. That both Yolo and Solano County have a stream keeper for Puda Creek that is funded, a position funded by a suit that was brought by the university and Peter Moyle to force some water to be allowed in the creek and not all be diverted. And those positions have sought private landowners who are willing to allow restoration to occur on their lands, and they've been quite successful. And Rich Maravich has about 3 miles of creek front over in the south area, one of the tribs in Pleasant Valley this year that is going to get planting, and they actually have irrigation set up for that. We actually did about 2,000 trees in our it's our biggest production, but we got about 2,000 starts produced this year entirely voluntarily. In previous years, we started with like 100, 200, 500, 800, and now we're getting into the low thousands just in terms of rolling out stuff and giving them to people. So we give them to the Woodland Tree Foundation, Tree Davis. I think there's I'm sorry, and then the experiments, we've got a grant to do some experiments, and this is somewhat tied to these efforts, satellite to them. And there's one in Lynch Canyon and over in another one in Pleasant Valley, and the idea is to see what happens if you allow cattle in on your plantings at different times of the year, or allow them to start accessing trees that have been planted in different years back from the planting. And there's been other studies like this, but the objective is to say, if you have a rancher who is willing to work with you, what's the least amount of time and that you need him to pull the cows off, or what's the best, what level of protection do you need? And these are common questions that I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, but there are some efforts now, another set of studies that will start to come into play in a couple of years here. So yeah, there's been a lot of volunteers, and there's been a lot of groups that we've donated starts to. The campus has taken several hundred, the reserve has taken them, Solano County Stream Keepers Group has taken them, Audubon, Yolo Audubon has taken them, Yolo County has taken them and put them in around landfills. I'm trying to wheedle those guys to open up one of the county roads for some plantings. I'd like to see the Hutchinson is in West Campus of Davis, if you're familiar, they're going to put in some housing, and associated with that is going to be a whole line of valley oaks going along the Hutchinson Boulevard. So, trying to make it more of the culture, the practice of the government, and maybe also outreaching to students is what we've been up to. So, thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Let me get your mic.
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious about the planting that you do on sidewalks, Hudson Boulevard, the parking lots. Is there acceptance through from the maintenance people or whoever for when the trees maturing?
There is. That is a question that I get, and I point out that the roots will go down first, and that you're going to, it's not an immediate concern. It might be a concern after 20 years, but that you have a lot of trees that you'd be cycling on 20-year intervals. So I don't have the best answer to give other than it's not something that you have to worry about immediately, and so it's good to put. We want the native tree in there, and we want to create as much structure and habitat as possible. Yeah.
You saw one photo of a valley oak planted in the lawn.
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing specialty watering for that?
No, it's just getting watered by the camp, whatever the campus irrigation is. And then, maybe as those things mature, it will be a benefit to the campus because they won't have to water that area anymore. As the trees get larger, maybe the lawns will actually go away. And I should actually mention something else that tags on to that. Arguments that I'm putting forward to the campus are, A, you're supplying more habitat for native species. B, you're potentially contributing to carbon sequestration. So the more hardwoods you plant, hardwoods are very dense, and so we can actually say campus, if you run a campus carbon budget, you might actually be able to look at offsetting some of the carbon emissions through plantings of trees. And then C, another argument is to throw shade on the sides of 2 to 3 story buildings. They're looking actively at doing solar on the rooftops and in some other places, but that you can use it in a landscaping argument for shading for buildings and also for parking lots. So, I mean, those are arguments that maybe not your restorationists, but your landscape architect people will respond to. Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah.
I saw your main focus is on valley oak, planting valley oak, which totally makes sense on Pewter Creek. But have you also considered planting blue oaks more in the urban settings, in the urban areas, because like in hardscape areas?
We do collect blue oak acorns and put them out, and I haven't put them in on as systematically within a campus. They've gone in. They mostly go to restoration projects where people are doing stuff right in the foothills. I've seen a few of them. Maybe other people here can answer that better, but I'm under the impression that they don't do as well with watering. So it would have to be in the really dry areas that are totally off.